And just to tell our television audience, hydrogen peroxide is a really good antibacterial. Pretty much that blows away everything. Nothing beats hydrogen peroxide. So that is, in fact, why those spray bottles are filled with dilute hydrogen peroxide. That kills bugs dead. Hey, so, all right, how many of you have ever heard of Lyme disease? Anybody had Lyme disease? Ooh, I don't want to know. Anybody that's had Lyme disease? Lyme disease is pretty nasty, and it is a vector-borne disease. It's not a viral disease. I think we actually covered Lyme in our discussion of rickettsia-like diseases. But you perhaps have heard of the Zika virus? Yes? No? It has actually been endemic in South America and specifically noted for having an effect on unborn children, resulting in microcephaly and birth defects, and pretty serious birth defects. And it's carried by a mosquito that is typically further south, but beginning to make its way up north. At the moment, the most northern range of the mosquito has been in St. Louis, but because climate change is affecting the overall temperature of the entire continent, it is beginning to move up. And it's a interesting virus in that generally it doesn't really cause much of anything, but for pregnant women during a very specific window in pregnancy, it can actually be pretty damaging. Not to be scary, but there are a number of vector-borne diseases, mostly mosquitoes. So these are viral diseases. So we were going through some of our bacterial diseases, but a lot of the hemorrhagic diseases, these are, and we got some really nasty pictures, sorry, diseases that generate just incredible bleeding due to connective tissue damage. Essentially, your vessels begin to leak, or clotting factors are inhibited, and people begin to leak fluid out of every orifice in their body. Not pleasant. Mosquitoes are the most common vector because they are little hypodermic needles on the wing. They begin to suck blood, but there's actually a transmission, a flow of juices as they are injecting stuff that is going to keep the blood from clotting in the immediate area, and that's what gives rise to the little itch and the bump in the mosquito. And so it is a common way for viruses to be transmitted, and so there are a whole range of systems in which an infected animal is bitten by a mosquito. The mosquito pulls the blood up, it gets infected with the virus, and then transmits it to other organisms. So it is a reservoir and the transmission system as well. So the mammals, primates, and some birds, and we do actually a lot of bird studies. And West Nile is another kind of viral vector or it is viral disease that is transmitted by mosquitoes using birds as a reservoir. West Nile is something that you can get it and might not even know it. And I think that the number of people that have been infected with West Nile that have antibodies against it is actually pretty high. But it is limited to where the vectors live, so that's nice. We do have emerging diseases as different populations move into habitats where they probably don't belong. The coronavirus, COVID-19, is actually an example of this kind of moving into different habitats, but specifically COVID virus is probably just from inhalation, whereas these are primarily going to be bites of some kind. So the mosquitoes generally don't survive the winters, but as they start to warm up, it's possible. So here is a general class of viruses that are mosquito transmitted, known as the flaviviruses. And these are, if you recall some of our viral nomenclature, This is an enveloped RNA virus. It is plus-stranded. That means that the RNA that comes into the cell is the RNA that can be directly translated into a protein set. And that's how it packages itself up. The mosquito, it used to be called Aedes, but now it's Stegomyia aegypti, is a mosquito that carries it. And dengue fever is a tropical disease that is spread by mosquitoes. Dengue is not found in the continental U.S., maybe in like the Keys or something in Florida, you might be able to find it. But certainly when you get into Central America, it's an issue. It is a very common arthropod or insect-based virus. It takes a little while. You have a incubation period, and then you have the initial fevery phase where you have, that is febrile, a very high fever, intense joint pain, and then this can turn into hemorrhagic fever, which is the extensive bleeding. One of the things I know that with dengue, the first bite is not necessarily particularly significant. It is the second exposure that really can cause the hemorrhagic fever. It is, when it happens bad, it is pretty serious mortality. At the moment, there's no vaccine and no treatment, partly because it doesn't happen in the in North America. So another virus also transmitted by that same mosquito is something called yellow fever, which is a classic sort of tropical disease. And as you can see here on the map, it is in the temperate parts of South America and the temperate parts of Africa. It is seasonal. It comes and goes with the mosquito cycle. This was actually one of the most significant issues in developing the Panama Canal. And nobody seems to know anymore of a pesticide, an insecticide called DDT, which if you ever see, in The Godfather, there was examples of it. In, your old Looney Tunes cartoons, where people will have a tank with a long tube and a pump, and you're going, and you're spraying stuff out. That was the standard way to kind of treat mosquitoes in a specific area. So you come into the room, and before bedtime, you have the screens down, but you still have mosquitoes from the door opening and closing. And so Papa would come through and spritz the room. DDT turns out to be really toxic. It's actually an organic molecule that bioaccumulates. In The Godfather, the Don had his little grandson wandering around his tomato patch, spritzing the bugs with this thing, probably DDT. It works really well to kill mosquitoes. One of the problems is it works so well that it lends itself to selecting resistant species and resistant individuals. And so over time, you end up with a lot of resistant insects. So it happens primarily in the tropics. The initial phase, again, is fever, nausea. This can turn into some liver problems where you end up with jaundice and then bleeding to death. There is an effective vaccine for yellow fever because people traveling to the tropics are very likely to be exposed to it. But other than that, without a vaccine, you're in bad shape. So here is Zika virus, and it's been seen for a while, first in Africa, and then now in South America, and particularly in Brazil, and moving its way into North America. It doesn't particularly cause death, and it's only during this narrow window of pregnancy that birth defects are seen. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a autoimmune kind of inflammatory disease that this can trigger that results in neurological defects and things. Start having tingling of the nerves, and nervous system difficulties. It's really, in terms of a virus, it's fairly rare, except during this window in pregnancy, which produces the birth defect of microcephaly, which is a abnormally small head. It also can very often cause a spontaneous abortion. Because the range is pretty narrow in terms of its infection point, it's still actually being studied. Just had this idea to see if we could make a piece of the Zika virus envelope, this part which the immune system sees, and look to see how many birds that are migrating from South America actually have been exposed to Zika virus using an immunological assay. And I don't know, we don't have any answers yet, but it's quite likely that there is Zika virus up here. Part of, the good news is the mosquito that carries it seems to be pretty specific and is not common in Illinois. So here's one, perhaps, until I was reading this, I'd never really heard of, the Bunya viruses. And these produce something known as sandfly fever, or Rift Valley fever. And it is a hantavirus. And so the hantaviruses are passed primarily from mouse droppings, or specifically from dried mouse urine and the dust of it. You also have some mosquitoes can transmit it as well. And so there just is a notion, this is a class of viruses, and they can produce a couple of different kinds of viral symptoms. So hantavirus became an issue in the West, particularly of the U.S., where there were lots of mice, and it doesn't have a mosquito vector. The disease is not too serious, but it can cause some pretty serious problems. If you end up having complications, it's actually fairly lethal. The sandfly fever is significantly less significant. It doesn't really cause too many serious effects. Hantavirus, though, is a bit of a problem because you can't prevent it by putting screens on the windows and blocking mosquitoes. You have to have really good sanitation, maybe a cat, and dried rodent urine is the apparent vector. And rats don't pee a whole lot, and so what they do pee is very concentrated and it dries up pretty fast, and I guess it can then be lifted up into the dust. So just say no to rodent urine is my motto. Now, this is another one that I'd never heard of until I started playing around with these viruses. The Rift Valley fever. And it is primarily in Africa. It's a mosquito vector, and it's found in livestock, which often have a more serious problem with it than in humans, particularly spontaneous abortions. So you can have mild fever, malaise, muscle stiffness and soreness, and it can go to liver damage, but generally not. And so you see it is endemic to pretty much all of Africa. Again, where that mosquito is. Chikungunya virus, chick-bee virus, also known as Toga virus. And it is another one of these stranded RNAs, a single-stranded RNA, the mosquito vector, and it has been spreading pretty well. You end up with a lot of people that might have it and not really even know it. It can probably lead to arthritis and things, but it's pretty low mortality. But you can see that, this sort of standard progression where it is in central sub-Saharan Africa, makes its way to India, very warm climates, into parts of Indonesia, and then making its way probably through air travel, and potentially even the bringing in of agronomic products that can have mosquitoes on them to parts of Europe, and then making its way up through Central America and a little bit in Florida. So lots of folks don't even have the symptoms. And these are some of the spots for the outbreaks, but it's not a particularly severe problem. Ooh, so you perhaps have heard of Ebola virus, Marburg virus, Zaire virus, we don't hear so much about. Probably a bat reservoir, and this results in a truly gruesome hemorrhagic fever. Very rapid onset. You have fever, a rash, vomiting, diarrhea, GI pain, that then moves on to liver and vascular disease. The blood vessels start to just absolutely leak out, and the mortality rates can be quite high. For Ebola virus, it's approaching 90%. This is one of those things in terms of viral outbreaks. It's a very distinctive looking virus, and it is a minus strand RNA virus, not to be overly nerdy, but that means that's a strand that is not able to actually be translated directly. A minus strand RNA virus has to carry in with it a protein that will serve as an RNA polymerase to copy the minus strand to make it into a plus strand. The plus strand can then be translated. Because when you have double-stranded nucleic acids, one strand is referred to as the template strand that the RNA polymerase is reading to make RNA, and the other strand is referred to as the sense strand, and the RNA that is produced is equivalent to the sense strand, and instead of having a thymine, you have a uracil, but that's kind of irrelevant, and that can be directly translated. Otherwise, you have to actually bring in some proteins to make that RNA, and it is a fairly nasty disease. One of the points here is that if you get Ebola or Marburg, you are really sick really fast. And so your ability to actually begin spreading it around is quite limited. We don't need to look at this guy's face, thank you. And so people that get it tend to stay right where they are. And it is transmissible through blood and fluids, and so people in the immediate care are at risk, but it's not being transmitted particularly because if you get it, you're so sick, you're not going to move. That's one of the things with coronavirus is that it's rather sneaky in that you get it, and for the first probably 3 to 5 days, you don't particularly feel sick, and yet the viral loads start to come up, you're coughing on people, and you're being spreading it that way. So Ebola is a kind of virus that has these little flashes, flare-ups, and then it dies back. Because if you got it, you're not going anywhere, and you're going to be dead before too long. It's a pretty nasty thing. A vaccine for Ebola may be kind of on the works, but it's not a standard kind of, it's not North America, so it's not dealt with a lot. Let's see, arenaviruses. These produce something called Lassa fever. It is a strange kind of RNA molecule, and we don't need to really worry about the details specifically, but the host ribosomes are actually what's doing the translation. So this is another class of viruses that cause human diseases. It is probably transmitted by powdered contaminated mouse urine, and it seems to be primarily found in Western Africa. So epidemics can have a higher mortality case, but it's not too serious. There is a fairly serious mortality in late-term pregnancies, both the mother and the fetus. So it causes multi-organ failure and a generalized sort of hemorrhagic fever, but not as bad as like Ebola. No vaccine, no treatment. It's a virus. The best prevention is rodent control. Have your mice pee somewhere else. So these are some of the places where it's been found. We have a Lassa virus in the southern part of Africa, in the Central African Republic, um, in West Africa, and then spots in South America. There was, a while ago, a single case in the U.S., or I guess 2 cases in the U.S., but it's not particularly significant here. So one of the things that, if you recall, last year, 2 years ago, that Ebola had a fairly large outbreak in Africa, and there were a few people that were coming back into the U.S. that had the potential of carrying it. And there may have been like a nurse that was working with Doctors Without Borders, something like that, came into Dallas, and there was some concern that she might have been exposed, and then had, of course, been on an airplane. And so there was quite a bit of anxiety. As it turned out, she didn't have it, but it is a potential issue. But because it's spread primarily through fluids, and if you have it, you're pretty sick, happily, these are not things that spread too much. That's all right. On the other hand, mosquito-borne viruses, these have the ability to spread pretty far. So, looking at a map here of West Nile virus distribution, this is a map that shows where we have some of the highest intensity of mosquitoes. I guess sea breezes are keeping it out of Florida, I don't know. But the upper coast on the mid-Atlantic, and I can speak from experience right there, a lot of the mosquitoes all up and down the Gulf Coast and into the Midwest, actually following along water and stuff. So these are some viral-borne diseases that are pretty common in the U.S. Things like West Nile, St. Louis encephalitis virus, Western equine encephalitis, as the name implies, mostly horses. They also serve as a reservoir, and people can get it. Eastern equine encephalitis, a lot of diseases coming out, and this is the typical way that they are transmitted. You have a bird host, and that bird, of course, is flying back and forth from South America all the way up to Canada, and in fact, probably, this represents the major flyway. So it could get over to here, but mostly straight up. And from there, mosquitoes pick it up, and then they can transmit it to humans. So most of these viruses are not particularly nasty. It's quite possible to get them, to be exposed to them, particularly if you're doing a lot of field work with birds. You might very well be exposed to it, and generally not have any kind of effects. You can start to have severity as it progresses, generating some nervous system problems, and then convulsions and coma. Thank you very much. So there are a couple of nervous system viruses that are pretty cool that we want to throw in here as well. And one that you potentially have heard of is the rabies virus. So rabies is a viral disease. So it is passed primarily through saliva, through a bite. So it's not too common passed human to human. I guess if you get bit by another person, that's a problem. And certainly, the zombie apocalypse. It's got a very distinctive shape, this sort of bullet shape to it. And it's able to infect pretty much all mammals. The bats often serve as a reservoir. So generally, you get a bite from an infected animal, a bat, raccoon, skunks. Dogs are particularly good reservoirs as well. And what we do is inoculate your pet. So that prevents them from being a vector or being a host. It also prevents them from getting it and having problems. Rabies generates some interesting neurological effects. And so you have animals that exhibit some fairly odd behaviors. It causes excess salivation, lots of drooling, kind of stumbling around, Animals can become quite vicious that normally are not. Another thing is daytime appearance of the normally nocturnal animals. So if you see a raccoon or a skunk or a bat that is floating around in broad daylight where they shouldn't be, that is a possible rabies-infected animal. So rabies has some interesting manifestations. So the victim gets bit, the virus is in the saliva, it enters the muscles, and it takes a while. It can be years. Generally, it's going to be months. And then the virus gets into the peripheral nervous system and begins migrating up to the central nervous system. You start to have encephalitis, inflammation of the brain and nervous system, and pretty much that's a lethal point at that point if you haven't had it treated. Which is why if you've been bitten by an animal, there are rabies vaccines and treatments that are taken if you've been bitten by a potentially rabid animal. So malaise, headache, then some of the nervous system issues, anxiety, delirium, excessive salivation, this notion of what's called hydrophobia, where the animal is frightened of water, primarily comes from a paralysis of the swallowing muscles, which means you can't swallow liquids very well, and so you start to choke and avoid water because of that. This then leads to coma and death. So there are treatments, but it is not an easy kind of thing to do. Primarily, if you've been bitten by a bat, I'd say you probably need to go to the emergency room and say, yo, I was bitten by a bat. So they can begin doing rabies vaccine treatment right away. In this case, this young lady was bitten by a bat, didn't really pay much attention to it, and then began showing symptoms approximately a month later. So what doctors did was everything they could to slow the viral replication. So we're going to induce the coma, chill the body down to reduce replication rate. Antivirals are given. And what you're trying to do here is allow the immune system to begin generating antibodies against the virus. And then when the antibody level comes up high enough, you go ahead and bring her out, and hopefully your immune response is now able to take care of it as the virus starts to replicate even faster. You end up with neuronal tissue damage, and it is a fairly low success rate, so it's actually quite controversial, and it does have pretty severe damage. So physical therapy, 4 years later, she is doing better. Slow speech and neurological issues. So now another viral disease that you may have heard about, but is completely gone from certainly the U.S. and most of the world. And this is the disease known as polio. And it is primarily a fecal transmitted virus. And so you have the oral fecal route. Wash your hands after using the bathroom, thank you. The initial symptoms then are diarrhea, where you're able to shed the virus, vomiting, cramps. Most folks actually do recover, but a percentage have increasing, worsening neurological problems. So you can have peripheral nervous system paralysis of swallowing, sometimes even the diaphragm, and that results in a real difficult time breathing, death due to suffocation, a really unpleasant death. There was this system known as an iron lung, which was essentially a pumping system that was able to apply pressure and push air out and then change pressure and bring air in. And you kind of leave somebody on that, hoping that the diaphragm paralysis would ease and I'm not so sure how well it works. I don't think it worked particularly well. There are a number of post-polio symptoms, and primarily it manifests itself as peripheral muscle weakness. And so muscle atrophy can happen later in life, and very often kids would end up with very atrophied muscles in the legs and have to have braces and crutches and things. And so, you may or may not know, Franklin Roosevelt suffered polio as a child, and later in life, he began to struggle with muscle atrophy. And pretty much as present, he was not able to walk without braces, and usually had a set of really hefty Marines standing beside him that would physically just prop him up and move him around. And the press was somewhat kept away from him in a wheelchair, and there was sort of a general understanding that it was not going to be part of the political landscape and brought up. And so photographs of him in his wheelchair generally weren't done, and he'd be propped up and able to speak. And this is, of course, before television as well. So this was actually one of the first big vaccine rollout efforts. And there are two types of vaccine strategies. One is known as the salt vaccine. And this is taking the virus, growing it up probably in chicken eggs or something, and autoclaving it, killing it. And then there was the Sabin vaccine, and this used a mutated strain that was attenuated. So both of them were very effective, and they essentially removed polio from the population. So polio isn't so much of an issue. You used to take it on a sugar cube. They would put a little drop of the vaccine on there, and you pop it in your mouth, and it would work. So, as you can see, in the U.S., polio is not an issue. In other parts of the world, it is still, in fact, a problem. And, during in times of war and things, the system stops and people continue to get infected. It's getting to be a lot better. There is some potential here, but in terms of it being endemic, it's really quite limited. So it's almost been eradicated completely in the entire world. In the U.S. and in the Western Hemisphere, it pretty much doesn't exist. All right, so I would say if you'd like, or even if you don't like, let's take a few minutes and maybe go upstairs and look at some of the plates and see if you can take some pictures, maybe take some notes, and see what happened. The guys have grown a little bit past their prime, but not dreadful. Oh, please, thank you. You're looking at me